The amounts could then be added up, and the governments could be held responsible by the people for the monies they received. The campaign was launched in 2002, and it has had an interesting history. The idea itself turned out to be a fertile fallacy, because while public opinion could put enough pressure on the big oil companies, fly-by-night operators and companies domiciled in non-democratic states were less susceptible. So the amounts could not be added up. Fortunately, the British government took up the cause and formed the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which brought together governments, companies, and civil society in an effort to establish international standards of transparency, which apply both to companies and to governments. In those countries that subscribed to the Transparency Initiative, the governments undertook to publish the amounts they received. That is actually working in countries like Nigeria and Azerbaijan. In analyzing the resource curse, I came to attribute great importance to what I called an asymmetric agency problem. According to the modern concept of sovereignty, the natural resources of a country belong to the people of that country, but governments, which are supposed to be agents of the people, put their own interests ahead of the interests of the people whom they are supposed to represent, and engage in all sorts of corrupt practices. On the opposite side, the managements of the international oil and mining companies represent the interests of the companies all too well. They used to go so far as to bribe governments in order to obtain concessions. Willing takers and givers of bribes are the root cause of the resource curse. Once I became aware of the agency problem, I discovered it everywhere. Communism failed because of the agency problem. Karl Marx's proposition, from everybody according to their ability and to everybody according to their needs, was a very attractive idea, but the communist rulers put their own interests ahead of the interests of the people. The agency problem is also the bane of representative democracy, because the elected representatives use their powers for their own interests to the detriment of the common interest. And in the recent financial crisis, the agency problem proved to be the undoing of the financial system. When financial engineers turned mortgages into securities by issuing collateralized debt obligations or CDOs, they thought they were reducing risks through geographical diversification. In reality, they were introducing a new risk by separating the interests of the agents who created and distributed the synthetic instruments from the interests of the owners of those securities. And the agents were more interested in earning fees than in protecting the interests of the principals. So the agency problem seemed ubiquitous. Yet, in spite of its pervasive influence, it escaped attention until recently. In my student days, it was almost totally unrecognized. In the last 20 years, it has received more attention, but mainly from economists who studied it in terms of contracts and incentives. In reality, the agency problem is more of an ethical problem, and analyzing it in terms of contracts and incentives actually aggravated the ethical problem. establishing the principle that people's behavior is governed by contracts and incentives had the effect of eliminating or at least diminishing ethical considerations. That may sound perverse, but only because reflexivity is not well understood. Values are less closely governed by an objective reality than cognitive notions. Therefore, they are more easily shaped by the theories that people adopt, and economic theory is a case in point. Markets are supposed to act as an invisible hand, bringing the demand and supply into balance. What makes the invisible hand so efficient is that there is no need to exercise moral judgment. All values can be expressed in terms of money, and money is fungible. Pecunia non olet. Money doesn't smell, the Romans used to say. But taking it for granted that all human behavior is guided by self-interest leaves no room for the exercise of moral judgment, and society can't exist without some ethical precepts.